So here we are, starting another recording for you guys. And Levi thought he would be clever by changing all of his clothes. And in reality, we recorded these two sessions back to back. So
Yep.
There you go.
That's
Hold
just
on,
John's way of saying he wants to prank everybody, make it think that this was one long session rather than two sessions broken up over 2 weeks. So, take it for what it is. He's a good one, though.
I do like to prank people. I am known for my practical jokes. But anyway, I believe...
Actually, I did change my clothes, guys, so I don't want to lie.
So I do believe we were last chatting, and Levi, you said you had 3 comments you wanted to make on frame, and you had shared the first one, but go ahead and recap, because I'm guessing for listeners this has been about a week gap. So what's going on?
Okay, so we were talking about frame, how to develop it, and I just wanted to get into the what can you do practically immediately to start developing frame, and that is start lifting and get serious about it. Find a program. For me, it was Strong List 5x5. It's an amazingly simple program. There's an app, and no, I don't get paid for endorsing that. I'm not sponsored. That's just free advice. Also add some upper body stuff in there. It's kind of lacking the upper body stuff. Get serious on your diet. That's going to help too. But okay. So
and I'll say, Levi, you might want to check your microphone. It's giving some kind of weird clicking. But I can't agree more with you when it comes to some form of lifting, exercise, keeping yourself in at least reasonable shape, right? The better shape you are in, the stronger your frame will be. It develops more self-confidence. It increases the amount of testosterone in your system. There's just an incredible wealth of reasons why you should start lifting. And people, I will tell you, when I wasn't doing it before, I kept telling myself, it'll have benefits. I know it'll be a good thing, but it can't really be all that big of a deal. I should be able to focus on other things for a while. It is not true. When you do start lifting, the peripheral aspects of how it benefits your life are way, way, way more powerful than you would ever expect if you haven't done it. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I would also like to emphasize that this is something that solves for a lot of other issues as well. But I think importantly, people naturally gravitate toward people that are good looking and healthy. It's a matter of signaling theory. But plain and simple, think about it from a guy's perspective. If you have a unattractive woman trying to tell you what to do, you're probably very unlikely to respond to her in that way. Who has stronger frame, her or the really, really, really hot woman who are more tempted to do what she's asking you to do because you think it's going to ingratiate yourself with her. And so that's a matter of appearances affecting your perception.
Well, for the sake of clarity here, you can't say who had stronger frame, right? Because they could have backwards strengths of frame from what you're implying. But what you're saying is, one, it has a more persuasive, alluring frame that makes you want to go inside, even if it's otherwise weak. So just a point of distinction to clarify for what we talked about last week. But continue.
I guess I would kind of bucket those two together. I don't necessarily divide too much in my thoughts around frame about the strength of it there and the quality, in the sense of they can be easily mistaken for the other, right? So I think there's this video that used to go around in the manosphere about this guy named Corey or something, and he was being interviewed by a reporter lady in Australia. He threw a big rager and got himself in trouble and all his friends or something. And for all accounts, this guy seems like a douche, but he's pretty much hitting
definition of an alpha post.
Yeah, and so that dude theoretically has really strong but really crappy frame. And so regardless of whether or not it was anything quality, it was still stronger, it seems, than the reporter that was interviewing him. And he, in many ways, I think would be considered a strong-framed individual. Whether that is worthwhile or not is, I guess I'll leave that up to the person watching the video. You make your own determinations, but I think I know which way you'll land up if you're a thinking person. That all said, I think that you can substitute a lot of quality of frame by having a really strong appearance. And this cuts both ways, because more people will probably listen to you and challenge you less, which might make you actually develop your internal frame slower. That said, it can be really important because you will still have a lot easier time when it comes to navigating social circumstances.
Oh, yeah. So I had this fun story that happened just a week and a half ago, right? I go out on a run with my kids. And usually I'm that weird guy who's pushing 3 kids on a 2-person jogging stroller for like anywhere from 5 to 8 miles at a time, all over hills and everything. And at one point, my daughter asks me, Dad, why do you go running so much? And I said, well, it's important to stay healthy, to look good and be in shape so that I can live long and be with you. And, some of the standard, health and wellness based reasons. And my son looks over at me and says, well, that's not what you told me last week. I'm like, okay, remind me, what did I tell you last week? You said it was because if you are in shape and you look good, then people will want to follow you. And that's how you will make a difference for Jesus. If you don't look good, people won't follow you. And how can you share the gospel if they don't want to follow you? And I've never been more proud of my son for remembering that and catching on. And so then I had to explain to him, well, for your purposes, right, you are designed by God to be a leader, to move forward in that way. And for my other daughter, who is the very, very girly girl of the, whatever you can think of feminine, that is how my daughter is. And so because of that, I'm explaining things to her from a different angle than I would to him. Because it would resonate with her and help her understand and want to stay in shape better. And so because of those things, there was a difference there. But I do think that it's important that we recognize, like, especially with physical fitness, even my 8-year-old son can pick up this idea of, oh yeah, I remember staying in good physical shape helps you earn influence, and that's how you're going to get the gospel out to the nations.
Yeah, real quick point of note on that. There's a few listeners right now that I know are starting to have their Gnostic panties in a twist real quick, who are thinking, oh my gosh, these physical things don't matter because it's all about the spiritual, man. Well, here's the thing. So when you look at a horse and you see a really old or really fat horse, is that glorifying? Is that a glorious horse? Does that represent its owner well? No, everybody looks at that ugly horse and thinks, oh my gosh, this poor animal is being abused by its owner. And it does not reflect well on either the horse or the whoever owns this horse or cares for it. In the same way, when somebody is a impressive physical specimen, it reflects well on the person or the God who has put the effort into and designing you to be that physical specimen that is impressive. So sorry, Gnosticism, BTFO, but it is important to operate in the way that God designs you. I think Socrates, there's a quote that was posted on RP Christians recently: no man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It's a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable. I think that's poignant,
Yes,
and there's a lot of quotes like this. There's a lot of quotes like this out there, but God designed us and our bodies to operate a certain way. And when we do the things that allow that operating to be glorious and represent the designer well, nobody's impressed with the horse that's ugly and fat or the Ferrari that somebody has abused over the years. When something is operating the way it's designed to operate and done well, it is glorified to the owner of that thing, and God owns us. So sorry, you don't get a pass. Go to the gym. Do you even lift, bro?
So I had this post early in RPC's history where I had comment or just asked the question generally, what are some of the dumbest things you've ever said in your life, right? Or in your marriage or whatever. And I remember that when my answer, of course, is when I was dating my wife, I think it was maybe even the first date we ever went on. We're walking down the street and I made the comment to her, I bet everybody looking around is thinking, how did a guy like him get so lucky to have a girl like her? Right. And I thought I was being this sweet, sappy, romantic type and puffing her up and making her feel good. And she looks back at me disgusted and says, don't ever say that again. I don't want people to think that I'm with somebody beneath me and who is, a slob or something. I want people to know that I have a good guy. Right. And that's just standard how we process things. We know that that's how it should be. But in our brains, we're so conditioned to think this backwards way that the world has taught us that we think that those sweet and sappy comments are the way that we should be processing the world. And so I like what you're saying here, Oz, is that, God doesn't want to be that God who has all the, crummy slobs. Not to say that he doesn't. I mean, God definitely has his moments where he's like, I will take the dregs of the earth. My salvation is open to everybody. But at the same time, like you say, are we bringing glory to him when we do that? Or if we stay the dregs of the earth and we make no effort toward our own sanctification, self-care, and all of that, then what does that say about, one, the authenticity of our own faith, and two, the power of God to transform us?
God takes the worst people, but he doesn't leave them in the worst circumstances. And that's
Amen.
obviously relative, but even Paul, who ended up dying a martyr's death, ended up more glorious than he started.
Right.
The
It's a
second
better
thing
way
you
to say it
mentioned
than
is,
I was trying.
well, the other thing you mentioned was that, this is something to be sappy and kind of self-deprecating is something that we learn from the world. But I think you would agree that this is something we would learn, unfortunately, from the church and from the pulpit as well as Christians is,
Correct.
oh, you are
Correct.
so lucky that this daughter of God would just succumb to whatever she sees in you, that she would deign to open her legs for you by some miraculous opening of the heavens, like Moses parting, the oceans or whatever. And it's like, good Lord, how come we have such a problem with attraction in the church? Maybe this is part of it. Anyways, we could digress on this for a long time.
So,
Levi, you had more
Levi,
points you were
number
going
2.
after.
Well, real quick before we move on to number 2, on the note that both of you guys were talking about, just as Jesus is the church's prize, so also if husbands are emulating Christ to their wife as Jesus does the church, then you are the prize for your wife, and you should view yourself as such, and you should treat your body as such. So just goes along with what you're saying. But I know on Secular Red Pill, they talk about that I am the prize, and, for the woman. And it's also that way. Philippians 3:13 talks about that as well. But point number 2, I think, is fail and fail often. Fail often and fail fast. Getting in situations where you're timid, you're uncomfortable, and then failing frequently. Obviously, probably pick things or situations that you want to get better at. I know for myself, I wanted to get better at talking with women. I was horribly nervous around it. And so I just decided to go say hi to random cute girls. And sometimes I'd use really stupid pickup lines because I thought it was funny. Remember one time I used, if you were a booger, I'd pick you first. And I knew it was the stupidest thing ever, but it made me laugh, and I knew it was going to be awkward. I went with buddies too. There weren't many buddies that did it with me, but my buddy Ben, he would go with me, and we had some good times. Also, almost got security called on us one time, so that was also fun. What do you guys?
And if you guys want more conversation on that point, I do have a post that I think is called "Initiate Often, Confident Always." And the point of the post is simply to say that the more that you put yourself out there, even if you fail, it still strengthens your frame because you are conditioning yourself to be used to and embrace rejection and failure. So that way, the next time it's all that much better. So a lot of people will take failure and think, oh, I can never try that again, right? Those are the people who have the weakest frames. But if you can learn, hey, I failed, it wasn't so bad, I got over it, I'm going to try again. The more times you fail, the more normal it becomes, the stronger your frame becomes, the less often you will fail.
Quick point of note on that. If you're doing approaches and you're not amusing yourself in that and you're not having fun with it, you're doing it wrong. So keep that in mind. There's also a post recently, field report on approaching on RPC, well worth reading. But essentially the person found out that the loss of the opportunity to approach when they didn't was worse than the rejection the time that they did. And I think that's also really important to consider. Every time you want to approach, but you don't, you're giving up the opportunity of what could have come. And opportunity cost as you grow older, as I found, is the real cutting thing that you find yourself regretting over time. So, Levi, you had a number 3, I do believe.
Yeah, I'm going to say before we move on to number 3, one of the beauties of failing and failing fast and frequently is that you actually learn. A lot of people I've noticed, and I'm kind of mentoring, discipling a guy right now, and he's historically asked me a lot of questions. Hey, what should I have done in this situation? Or there's this girl, what should I do? And he's afraid to fail. And because he's afraid to fail, he won't actually go out and do said thing and learn. So if you want to get good at interacting with women and being flirty, something that I wanted, and I still want to be able to be flirty and talk with women normally, you do have to go fail, and you do have to go learn. That's part of internalizing. So you can't just have all this head knowledge or whatnot. There's you actually have to go do those things. And we'll move on to point 3. and it's completely unrelated to point number 2, is that you put yourself in uncomfortable situations. You absolutely have to do things that you normally you've wanted to do, but you wouldn't do, especially if it frame usually, well, I guess frame is used a lot, or we talk about a lot in the context of interacting with other people. So go do activities where you're going to have a lot of interactions with other people and things that are uncomfortable. For me, that was salsa dancing. I told you guys about going and talking with cute girls. Sometimes having a difficult conversation. There's a pastor, super overweight. I went and told him he didn't have self-control. You know, it did not go very well, but I wanted to get comfortable. Yeah, he was this 400-pound dude. He'd been a 400-pound dude for years, and I was like, dude, what are you doing? And he said I was legalistic, and I didn't really have much to go on after that. I should have thought it out a little bit better, but if I hadn't done it, there was that opportunity. I would have had, I would have regretted it. So just do things that are uncomfortable. What are some things that were uncomfortable for you guys when you started developing your frame?
So in answering that, I'm going to just also offer a few pieces of advice as far as guys who want to develop a stronger frame. So I agree with all of you. You said, lift, approach, put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Also, put yourself in comfortable situations where you find yourself being an expert, where other people listen to you because you have the gravitas of the knowledge and experience. You'll notice that they behave differently around you than when you go somewhere, whether it's salsa dancing, or in my case, I went to learn to sail. There's somebody else who's the expert, who's the teacher, and you pretty much automatically adopt their frame. Frame is amoral in the sense of it can be a good thing to adopt other people's frame if it's deserved and it's well established. You want to learn from other people, and so when you put yourself in both kinds of situations, it will more acutely help you understand whose frame you're operating in, right? So if you're an expert in a situation, you're teaching other people, and they're hanging off you for every word and paying attention to you, and you're giving them solid advice, you'll get a sense of that feeling, and you'll recognize that in other areas of your personal life. On the contrary, if you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation where you are the novice, you will also get that feeling of what it's like to be the person in another person's frame, and you'll be able to more finely parse it as you interact with other people. And that's the other thing too, is I would say we say STFU for a reason. That's probably the best place to start. And part of that is giving yourself time and the mental capacity not to think of a response, but to consider whose frame am I operating in right now? As you interact with people in your day-to-day life, in your family and your work, and you start asking that question in every interaction, or as often as you remember it, you'll start to develop a more keen sense of frame and where you fit in that line. And so I'd say if you do those things consistently, part of it is you just need to start beginning to develop a sense of awareness around whose frame you're operating in. And when you do that, you'll start seeing what qualities lead to strong frame and what qualities lead to weak frame, and you'll naturally begin to develop some of those things.
Because passive aggressive silence is not a proper tactic for handling an argument. But the point of STFU is not to be passive aggressively silent. It is to give yourself the ability to pause, think about who you are, what you're doing in this conversation, and then to be able to acknowledge and say, okay, now I'm going to get back into myself and my own center, and this is what needs to happen out of this, rather than you thinking, oh, well, STFU is just about telling my wife, oh, yeah, haha, I'm not going to listen to you, and I'm cold-hearted and all that, right? You're not doing yourself any favors.
Absolutely. So as far as times I've been in a situation where I was made uncomfortable, anytime I've taken a new job, anytime I've put myself in a situation where I did not have any kind of expertise or knowledge, I automatically feel at a disadvantage. And I think those are situations where I've grown, both in how I operate in terms of other people's frames, as well as in just my own knowledge of a subject. And it's important to do that. So I agree with Levi, put yourself in uncomfortable situations, because not only will you grow greater skills, but you also have, again, that feeling of being in someone else's frame. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And then secondly, if you want more confidence, develop more competence, because the more competent you are, the more confident you will be, and you will not become more competent unless you stretch yourself.
Which is where lifting builds that confidence. And let me just say this, by the way, I talk a heck of a lot about making disciples, right? my life, passion, and mission. And one of the things that Oz is talking about here is pretty much the entire premise of disciple making in the first place, which is be a confident person in the way that you follow Christ so that other people will want to follow Christ too, right? The more confident you are and the more along you are in your walk, the more likely people are going to say, oh yeah, I want what he has. And so in that situation, a lot of people will mistakenly take the view of saying, oh, well, I can't start discipling somebody until I am so far along in my walk. Whereas in reality, sometimes part of what you need to get there in order to build your own frame, strength, and competence is just to go out there and start leading people in the first place. And, if that means you fail, and then you learn and you pick yourself up. You've become strengthened because of the process, and then you keep going on. But it also means that as you grow and become the most competent believer that you possibly can be, you can hit that point where you can tell people with all sincerity the same thing Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow me as I follow Christ, right? What he's saying is, hey, I'm following Jesus. I'm pretty good at this. I want you to take after my example and start following me, because if you don't know how to follow Jesus, at least you see me, you can follow me. So let's go do it, right? And he says the same thing in a handful of other books where he talks about this idea of, and I think Philippians 3 is probably one of the best places where he says, let all of us who are mature take such a view of things. And if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you, which is like the most, it comes off as probably the most arrogant way that you could possibly say this. And if you disagree with me, don't worry. God will make it clear to you that I'm right on this. And so he says two things. The first is, only let us live up to what we've already attained, saying, don't try to do more than you're capable of doing right now. But then number two, join with others in following my example, brothers, and take note of those who live according to the pattern we gave you. And so the idea there is that he's saying, I set an example. I'm the confident one. I am mature. I have set a pattern for people in your ministry who know how I live. And now, just as Jesus set a pattern for me and I set a pattern for them, I want you to take note of them and follow the pattern that they have. And this is how generational discipleship begins and builds. And that's what Frame is ultimately able to point toward, is the advancement of God's kingdom.
Amen. On that note, so what do you guys think of this? As you were thinking, this popped into my head, John, that in the past, I've done kind of like a no-fap group, where basically no porn, masturbation, or orgasm. And I feel like I didn't struggle with certain things, but definitely jacking off. I did that regularly. And then I decided to see if, my buddies were interested in, not looking at porn, masturbating, orgasm. So I was like, okay, guys, well, let's do this thing. I didn't necessarily think of myself as the leader of the group. I just was the guy that started it. That's all I was doing, and kind of keeping people accountable and daily updates, hey, how's everybody doing? I ended up doing really well at it, really way better than anybody else. And I think that I based on even though you don't have a certain thing mastered, you can start leading and get yourself to the point where you've mastered it. That's just my thoughts. What are your thoughts on that? I'm not saying that's the right way to do it or the wrong way to do it. That's just what worked for me in that particular context.
So like I was saying before, in most situations, when you have, so I guess what I was saying is that a lot of people will object to the idea of making disciples, saying, well, I'll do it when I'm mature enough, when I've learned enough, when I'm ready. And so because of that, they just constantly postpone and delay. What you're saying is, well, you had a situation where you might not have been ready or prepared for a position of leadership, and yet by stepping in, you became that, right? Yeah. And so I think that Patrick, if he were here, loves to use the phrase that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Right? And so you step out and God will be the one to make you qualified for as long as you're living up to what he's doing. And the idea of saying, I have to be prepared before I go do something is really your way of saying, oh, God can't use me and prepare me. It's not God's work, it's my work. So I'm going to be the one to be prepared and do it. Whereas if you step out in faith and recognize, hey, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know if I'm ready or not, but I trust that God wants me doing it, so I'm going to do it. That's your way of saying, this is God's work. He's going to be the one to do it. I'm just a vehicle to let it get done. That doesn't mean you can ignore your path to competency, but it does mean that you can not use God as a crutch, but basically say, look, he is the one who's accomplishing the work and he will qualify me as I go.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so yeah, I thought I thought something like that.
I will keep my comments brief, and I would just say that the world today, especially in the West, is so devoid of initiative that anyone who takes initiative will automatically find followers. So it is not to minimize anyone's accomplishment to that end,
Totally.
but there seriously is a deficit of men particularly, but people in general who are taking initiative, especially in the conservative church and elsewhere. So I applaud that, but we need more people who are doing that, because there will be people who are looking for someone to follow. So a couple quick things I want to point out too, just as I've been thinking about the topic of frame. I want to give an example. This is, it's kind of history, mythology to a degree. It's the Alexander the Great encounters the Greek philosopher Diogenes. And the story basically goes, there's a super poor philosopher hanging out, and Alexander the Great wanted to meet him. Alexander the Great, this great conqueror, comes to meet Diogenes, and Diogenes seems unimpressed, and Alexander the Great says something effective like, do you want anything? And Diogenes says, yeah, could you move out of my son a little? And so Alexander was so impressed by this that he said, but truly, if I were not Alexander, I wish I were Diogenes. And so Diogenes is so in his own frame that even this emperor who had basically conquered the known world doesn't affect him. He is still very much within his own frame. And so I think this is a good example anecdotally of a historical myth that has permeated a certain degree of Western culture that establishes the idea that a frame or a strong position comes from an internal stability that can even defy emperors. And I think Christians have a lot to learn from that anecdote. That said, there are three areas that I think are worth talking about, and it's frame relating to women, frame relating to men, and frame relating to God. So we kind of already talked a little bit about frame relating to men between Alexander and Diogenes, but I'm just going to go ahead and open it up. AMOG. So different definitions have been thrown out there for the acronym. The one I go with is alpha male of the group. So here you are, you're hanging out with a group of friends, and who is the alpha male of the group? Every guy intuitively knows this, and there is a jockeying that happens for it, and that is ultimately a battle of frame. So what do you guys make of the concept or the application of AMOG?
So just what you said, there's a dominance hierarchy within all groups, guys, gals, interaction wise, it just happens. It's subconscious. It's immediate. Amongst guys though, there is one guy that kind of rises to the top. I haven't really had too much of a problem with it. But when it happens, it's painfully obvious to me, and I hate it. I absolutely hate it. If it's a friend and I want to be in his frame, I'm totally good with that. But I've never had that happen. It's always some stranger, and it just happens sometimes. I don't have too many experiences with it, though. Praise the Lamb, I think. What about you, John?
Yeah, so I would say there is definitely a hierarchy that has to be recognized and understood, and that's different for women. And we've talked in the past about how females have their own feminine social matrix, and it works on a more social benefit type basis, whereas men, it's kind of every guy for himself within his own place in the hierarchy. And some guys will try to rise, and others will say, I respect that guy's the leader here, I'm just going to go with that. And I don't know how much of that is because guys have been so trained and conditioned that when one guy is alpha, he's probably the only alpha in the group, right? And so there's some part of it where guys might respect and honor the hierarchy because they've been conditioned to be submissive, whereas another aspect of it is that even when you do see guys who are vying for that position on top and kind of button heads a little bit, eventually one will back down and acknowledge. I think that is a testament to the fact that the way the male frame works when in interaction with other men, does at least respect that hierarchy to some degree if it is established. But sometimes it's not always clear what that is. But when it comes to, the first thing that pops into my mind is just honoring actual hierarchies that are set up. And so some people will take red pill concepts and say to their, go to their employer and start trying to give this very brash type of frame of standing up and being pushy and trying to get their way all the time to their boss. And that's not necessarily going to work, right? Because he can fire you at a whim if he doesn't like you. And so you have to actually respect existing hierarchies, whether you like it or not. And so and that's if you want the result. Now, of course, that's not to say that you have to hop into your boss's frame. What you're saying is, my boss has something to offer me, and I have something to offer him. If I want what he has to give me, then I have to be willing to give him what he wants from me, right? And so that's not necessarily entering his frame, it's an exchange. And so what you're saying is that in order to keep getting your paycheck, I am willing to exchange a portion of my service, which means subsiding the way that I would do things in order to give him that benefit that he's looking for. So just bear in mind that if you are the pinnacle of the hierarchy in dealing with other men, that's one thing. But if you are not the pinnacle and there is de facto authority over you, respect that, as long as it fits in your framework. Now, if you're saying, I'm fine with getting fired, doesn't really matter, I can just go get another job because you have abundance when it comes to your career, then all the better. Go do what you want to do. And if your boss doesn't like it, say, fine, I'm out. I got a better offer at the next place, right? So you don't have to respect the hierarchy, but if you are dependent and you don't have abundance, then you have to be worried about stuff like that.
Yeah, actual abundance, not just the mindset.
Yep. So I would just point out a couple quick things. I know we're kind of pushing up against time here, so I'll be brief. I think that generally speaking in our culture today, we see alphas isolate themselves and look for beta followers. There's a whole podcast in and of itself to explore that concept. How can alphas cooperate together? A huge concept that needs to be fleshed out.
Which I feel like is a lot of what we're doing right now, right? Trying
I
at
think
least.
laying a lot of the groundwork that needs to be laid. I think one of the things too that has been helpful to me as a shorthand, a rule of thumb of sorts, if you want to know who the alpha is in a relationship with another man, if you can talk to him like your kid brother, you're the alpha.
Yep.
All right, good. So we've kind of talked a bit about frame relating to women in terms of there being tests and the attendant upside and downside that comes to that. So let's go ahead and just skip over to frame relating to God. And John, I know you have a lot to say on this, so I'm just going to pass it over to you on that.
Yeah, the one thing that I would want to say is a lot of people have this idea that, well, if you're doing whatever the Bible says and whatever God's will is, that's what you have to align yourself with, then you are not living in your own frame. You're living in God's frame, and therefore you can't really be alpha because you don't have your own internal point of origin. You have an external point of origin defined by God, right? And so the biggest thing that I would want to communicate to guys is that if you actually understand the way that sanctification and transformation happens in the Christian faith, God is not an external source, right? So in the Old Testament, we have a God who is external, speaking down, telling people, hey, I'm this outside divine entity who's going to tell you who I am and what I expect from you. And that's why the covenant of the law ultimately failed, because people can't really live on that terminology. And so at some point he says, okay, instead of just telling you who I am and what I expect, I'm going to become one of you. And that's when he came in the person of Jesus and says, now I'm going to live in front of you, show you, and be side by side with you, not just telling you, but being a model to you. And so then Jesus tells us at one point, yeah, you guys still aren't really quite getting it. You constantly are showing your little faith, and ultimately the humanity killed him, right? Showing how horrible they misunderstood what he was trying to communicate. And so he says, all right, at this point, I'm going to do something that's even better than God incarnate, right? He says, now it is more important for you that I go, because unless I go, the Spirit or the Comforter will not come. And so what he's saying is that the entirety of the divinity of God in bodily form is sitting there in front of us, walking and talking and teaching us and telling us and showing us who he is. And he still says that this idea of the Holy Spirit is better than all of that. And so what I gather from that is when we see the Holy Spirit is he doesn't come as an external force like the Father or Jesus did. He's an internal force who changes us and transforms us and makes us more like himself, so that as we are transformed into Christ's likeness, we hit this point where, not hit this point, I guess it's a constant progression to become more and more so that we just naturally have the internal inclinations that God would want us to. So when I do something biblical or godly, it's not because the Bible told me to, it's because I want to do it, right? And so my passion to make disciples is not, well, Matthew 28 says I have to go make disciples, so I better, get off the couch and go do it. No, I do it because I'm passionate about it. I love it. It's, I've been transformed in my heart to want to do that. And so that is my internal point of origin. It's not that I do it because God told me to. I do it because it's the most incredibly awesome thing I've ever done in my life. And so because of that, as somebody becomes transformed into the likeness of Christ, then the frame of Christ is not external to them anymore. It is their own frame.
Amen. So good. Chug, 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 chug. Okay, cool.
Any thoughts on that, Oz? I know you probably got about a minute and a half left. If you wanted to comment on anything.
Substantially more than a minute and a half more thoughts than that, so I'm going to go ahead and let it rest for now. But I know Levi wanted to close us out for the last minute here.
Okay, so real quick, did you guys want to touch on frame and God? Since we only covered like 3 minutes of it, we could do a little bit of that starting next week and then start to go over the sidebar. Or do we just want to go straight to the... Okay, so guys, that's what we're going to do next week. We're going to touch on how to have a godly frame and being in God's frame. And then we're going to start going over
as well as the other half dozen things about frame that just need to be said that we didn't get to yet anyway.
Yeah, so it might be... We'll see how it goes. But we are looking to go over the sidebar. 101, fitness develops attraction, and 102, desire and the curse of Adam and Eve are what we'll hopefully be covering next week. Anyways, guys, it was great talking with you. And you guys have any other closing comments?
Have a good one.
I think we're good.
All right, later,
Adios,
guys.
brothers.
Later.
Adios.